I have something to admit. I buy a lot of coffee and I don't drink most of it. So for the sake of it, I want to try different variations of coffee. And this is not just me, this is a lot of people. And I know your question, where are we going with this? But it's very relevant to what we're going to discuss today. But before that, just a quick disclaimer. This isn't a video about why coffee is good or why coffee is bad. There are many videos already covering those topics. Nor is it one on the history of coffee. It's more about how coffee became so significant in shaping our history. We'll go through on how it was initially used as worship, then as medicine, then it became so significant that in Turkey it became grounds for divorce in cases where men weren't able to provide coffee. Then about a guy who smuggled coffee beans by taping it to his stomach and bringing coffee to India for the first time. And also why Americans don't drink as much tea as they do with coffee. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it. To understand a little about how coffee originated, there are multiple stories. One of the prominently accepted stories is the myth of Kaldi. Kaldi was a goat herder in Ethiopia, and one of the days he notices his herd chewing on these particular berries. His herd starts to prance and dance around, somewhat getting this bump of energy. Curious to what has happened, Kaldi chews some himself and notices the energizing properties. There's one story which says a passerby monk found Kaldi in all this joy. And this passing monk struggled with prayers. He would often fall asleep. And when he found this berry, for him it was like his prayers were answered because now he was able to stay up and pray till late. Now there's no clear indication whether these were Christian monks or Sufi monks, but this is where it starts to spread. Of course, there are many stories of how coffee came to be as a drink later on. It wasn't likely until the 14th or 15th century that we had our first cup of coffee. So from Ethiopia, it was brought to Yemen, where a lot of it was initially used for worship and eventually for medicine. There are a few accounts of it entering the world of Sufis, and Sufis start to spread it across to other Sufis, using it to stay up for longer for dhikr, which is a practice of remembrance of God. Sufis as a practice would do dhikr as a group. It became known to be consumed in Sufi gatherings where the drink was consumed to gain a more spiritual state. It became a core part of practicing Sufis. Slowly though, by the 15th century, the Yemenis started to see that this could be something they could make money out of. And slowly it started to spread across the Arab world through trade. So once it started to spread across trade, one of the early movements was that it started to move across interlinked sides of the Muslim world. And then we had our first ever coffee house pop up. One of them goes back to Constantinople, 1475, modern day Istanbul. But that story been argued against a lot because Ottomans got coffee from Yemen and they hadn't conquered Yemen back then. The other one that's been recorded to have come up as 1400s or the early 1500s. And I want you to take a step back. This isn't just a Starbucks popping around the corner. This is about to change conversational forums at a scale they didn't expect at that time. The rule at that time though, Khair, the governor of Mecca, found people drinking coffee in the mosque, which he misunderstood for wine initially. And he found that people were using the beverage to stay up the night and pass in prayer. He went in to find more about coffee houses and found that coffee houses brought in discussion on the ruler. Afraid that people might use this as an avenue to unite against him, in 1512 he sets a ban on it. Now some accounts say that he was afraid that people were using it to get intoxicated, and that's why he banned it. However, back then Khair was under the Sultan of Cairo, and the Sultan of Cairo was quite fond of coffee. Once he found out, he quickly overturned the ban on coffee in 1524, and some accounts say the ruler was exiled right after. This was just the beginning, and after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt and Yemen around the 1550s, the places that had coffee prominence, the Ottoman brought back coffee to Turkey. That's why the story of the first coffee house being in Turkey in 1475 is a bit conflicting. But once it's in Turkey, it becomes an integral part of people's lives. And I saw this interesting article pop up that there was a rule on women being able to divorce men on grounds of not being able to provide enough coffee. Now, it's kind of true that it's possible, but it wasn't a blanket rule. The way rulings worked with divorce was that judgments were passed by qadis, who were the definition magistrate and judges of a Sharia court. So they would pass the rulings based on the teachings they had and expert opinions. So in general, the ruling was that if the man isn't able to provide essential goods or essential needs, then it can stand for grounds of divorce. So by chain of association, coffee at one point became a very essential part of Turkish life, and there could have been divorces that came out of it. Now stay here with me. Coffee is already becoming an interesting discussion in trade politics, and by the 1500s, there's already been a ban on it. So it only gets interesting from here. Around the 16th century, the Ottomans owned most of the coffee trade, if not all of it. And the Ottomans were very smart in that way. They only allowed the exit of beans after they've either been boiled or slightly roasted to prevent germination, so that none of the other countries could actually grow it. However, they weren't able to hold them for long. One famous story links to a Muslim pilgrim, Baba Budan, who managed to smuggle 7 coffee beans taped to his stomach. The more important one is that of the Dutch. Around the 1600s, the Dutch dominate global trade. It is said that the Dutch smuggled an entire plant from Aden in Yemen to Netherlands. Now the Dutch have influence around that time, not as much. They are relatively small as a power back then. Now once the Dutch get a piece of this lucrative trade, they expand to Ceylon in Sri Lanka, where they weren't able to grow as much, some due to climatic conditions. Then they further expanded production to Java in Indonesia. With the failure of the local government in Java, the Dutch East India Company takes over. Now the Dutch East India Company scales their production to a length where they start to influence the price of coffee depending on how much they produce. And this kind of sets up the major coffee networks, mostly dominated by Dutch East India Company, Ottomans, and eventually the British got into it too. And now you have these 3 major empires controlling the coffee trade, and it becomes quite a significant source of revenue for their empires. Now there are stories of how coffee may have reached Europe earlier, like 1526 in Hungary and 1529 in Vienna when the Ottomans attempted siege. But there are a lot of accounts of where coffee did not exist with the Ottomans back then. We already touched upon how coffee houses in Mecca were banned in 1512 by the governor, concerning on what discussions it was bringing. So it was simple, right? The way it worked was that coffee houses became a place for gathering, and caffeine usually elevated people's thinking and senses. Naturally, the discussions started to go longer and further. So after Mecca, coffee houses started to see their way into Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, initially for religious purposes and eventually moving into non-religious forums. It becomes a hub for discussions, starts to enter non-religion domains where the discussion isn't primarily linked to Sufis. It starts to become a secular arena of its own where people from all walks of life kind of discuss with each other, meaning that now discussions of all sorts are taking place. This scares the Ottoman at the time over political and social structures. They tried to ban it at the time. One chief cleric, Effendi, issued a fatwa at the time to try and ban coffee, causing a shipload of coffee to be dumped into the sea in Constantinople. Around the 17th century, it was a capital offense at the time, and there were accounts of Sultan Murad IV who would walk into the streets of Istanbul as a commoner and decapitate coffee drinkers that he would find. But it was too late. There were coffee houses around every corner. Leading up to the 19th century, there were 2,500 coffee houses in Istanbul alone. One of the first accounts of consumption of coffee in Europe comes in Italy, back in the 1600s when Ottomans expanded their trade to Europe. Although it was often associated as sinful given the Islamic association. As it first arrived, Pope Clement VIII was asked to denounce the drink. He refused to ban it before trying. Once he got a taste, he is quoted to have said, "This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it." And after his approval, it starts to spread across Europe. It may have reached Vienna around then, or it may have reached Vienna around the 1680s when the Ottomans left from their attempted siege. Stories account to it being found in the leftover supplies of the fleeing Turks, which they earlier mistaken for camel fodder, which one of the generals who had spent time in Turkey with a smell quickly realizes what they're burning is not fodder but coffee. However, of the most places, the most interesting build-up it has is London. The first coffee house opens in 1650s by a Lebanese Jew by the name of Jacob, with the lines saying, "For some who delighted in novelty." This still exists at the same very site. Coffee houses slowly started to pop around London. It starts to become an integral part of a London that from previous centuries started to experience mass immigration. So it's a very migrant working force population that interacts with a coffee house culture, which gives birth to various forms of coffee houses. Coffee houses started to become this place where people would come to discuss about science, politics, news, sometimes delivered by experts, sometimes the local folks discussing it, or sometimes people just coming to listen in. They came to be known as penny universities, where for the price of a coffee, you'd get to participate in this detailed discussion delivered by experts. Think of this like listening to Joe Rogan live, because the discussions ranged across various things. Then you started to see coffee houses designated for people from different walks, Catholics, Jews, traders, merchants. It started to become like gathering houses, like Facebook groups. Of course, something like this threatened the monarchy at the time. So King Charles II is worried that this might become a place where the public revolted against the throne. So around 1675, he tried to ban coffee shops, stating that they have produced very evil and dangerous effects and were also a disturbance of the peace and quiet realm. So a few days before the ban came into effect, King Charles was forced to reverse it. But men would spend so much time in coffee houses, there started to come out petitions from women against coffee houses. But historians differ on whether women attended coffee houses as customers or not. Though by the late 18th century, the British or the East India Company started to invest more into the tea trade, just because it was more profitable at the time for them and was working well from the colonies they had, like India and Sri Lanka. Now, around the 1700s, Britain is facing a huge problem. They've just come out of a war and they're in huge debt. At the time out of the war, they had raised their debt from 72 million pounds to almost 129 million pounds. British at the time then introduced the Stamp Act of 1765 in Britain's colony of America. And this brought over the big protest of no taxation without representation. The argument they made was that they didn't have any representation back in Britain, so they shouldn't be taxed. I know this sounds like a lot we're getting to, but this is just about why Americans didn't like tea as much. So anyways, basically the Americans voiced against it, voicing that if they are taxed, they should be represented. Along with protests, this led to boycott of British goods, which eventually led to them repealing the act a year later. Then the Townshend Act is passed in 1767, followed by 1768, which is a series of tax impositions which further fueled more protests. Most of the taxes were eventually repealed in 1770 by Ministry of the Land North. And then they imposed the Tea Act in 1773. And this wasn't to tax the American colonies or anger them further. Now, this was an attempt by the British to bail out the British East India Company. The British East India Company is in huge debts and they have these huge amounts of unsold tea. Basically, the Tea Act allowed a sale to American colonies without having to pay duties or tax. This was the turning point to a lot of things. The American colonies are fueled with rage. One, because this gives the British East India Company monopoly over the tea sale in America, which puts a lot of American merchants out of business. Two, it validates or establishes the right for Britain to tax American colonies. A group from the Sons of Liberty in December 16, 1773 disguises themselves as Mohawk Indians, boarded these 3 ships in Boston Harbor and destroyed over 92,000 pounds of tea that British East India Company had gotten. And this led to the Boston Tea Party, a famous tipping point protest that led to the American Revolution. And as protest, this led to Americans refusing to drink tea, and some say this is what continued for a long time as a form of pride to drink coffee instead of tea. And we kind of evidently see that today in US. And going back again, this moment was so significant that this was the tipping point to the American Revolution. And the rest is history. Now this brings us back to modern day. Things have changed. Coffee houses don't exactly exist as they were back then. The coffee houses today are a representation of our time today. Revolutionaries are no longer revolutionaries changing policy, but revolutionaries changing the scene through technology. People building tech companies, authors writing books, and all sorts of things happening still in coffee shops. And the way we live has also changed, so that's also another representation. Some people move fast with to-go orders, some people sit by themselves, some sit with another person or romantic partner, or some will come in a group to catch up. It's no longer a place for people to meet new people because of how we've changed how we meet people. But for instance, these still continue to exist in Turkey. It was pretty cool to see it survive over time. But it would be interesting to see if something like this continues to exist in the next few decades. And I think history is pretty clear on how our economies changed to shift distributions of coffee to concentrate to fewer players. Where we link ourselves to a global conversation is usually association, trends, and perception. People don't buy a $4 coffee just to have a coffee. It's an association, and maybe it's following a trend. Like, think about this. Someone walking with a $4 coffee cup across Wall Street versus someone having their slow cup by an old cafe in a slow town. And for me, coffee shops have become these places where I think of ideas, build on my scripts, and just sometimes to get away and find myself around people that are discussing and building on things. But this also brings a question along the chain. The lives we live are so different. From the person who picks the beans to the person who delivers it, the person who roasts it, the person who makes the drink, and the person who sips it. A French traveler from the 18th century would narrate, "But I know well these two products have accounted for the unhappiness of the two great regions of the world. America, as in the Caribbeans, it has been depopulated so as to have land on which to plant them. African has been depopulated so as to have people to cultivate them." And yeah, today it is very much an integral part of our lives. It's synonymous with having that initial interaction with someone in a romantic sense, to meeting someone for a business deal, or offering someone a beverage to welcome them to your house. For me, I always saw coffee as a product that came out of corporate marketing. It did definitely change how we distribute it, but the story of why it's become part of our lives is so much more than that. There's this beautiful story of love, greed, war, and enlightenment that's built us this coffee culture that we have today. And to end, there's this beautiful line that Mark says in his book, Common Grounds. It is presenting us with a stark reality of the life of the people that make it and the life of people that drink it. People who make about $5 to $8 a day, touching lives of people who make $5,000 to $8,000 a day, drinking through a journey of wage gaps from the pickers, packers, movers, roasters, baristas, and the consumers.